Hello and welcome to the March 30th edition of Points of View. I'm Andrew Kirkman and I'll be your host today. Let's take a look at the news rundown for this Friday. We'll start with the GOP update and move on to the UN-backed peace plan for Syria, talk about the oil industry group publicly blaming Obama for our continually rising gas prices, the Supreme Court's decision on the 2010 Affordable Care Act, and the House approval of Representative Ryan's budget plan. Later, we'll explore the issue of education reform as we sit down with Madison Gardner, co-founder of the new group on campus, Students for Education Reform, and then we'll interview the executive director of the Tennessee Charter Schools Association, Matt Throckmorton. The two of them will provide insight on varying types of reform to give you a better perspective on what the issue entails. But now, here's the news rundown. And we'll start with a GOP update. With just about half the state's primaries left to go, Mitt Romney continues to lead the GOP primary race by 295 delegates, according to the Associated Press numbers, which include non-binding delegates who have told the wire service which candidate they support. Though candidates need 1,144 delegate votes to win the nomination, many, such as Senator Mitch McConnell, feel that the race is essentially over, and it would be best to begin rallying behind the almost certain nominee. However, the senator declined to overtly name the candidate he supports. Santorum took 49% of the vote in the latest primary, Louisiana's last Saturday, and Romney won in Illinois with 46.7% of the vote on March 20th. The next primaries will take place in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Wisconsin on April 3rd, and the rest will continue through June 26th. Moving on to Syria now, though Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has promised to spare no effort to enforce the UN-backed peace plan put forward by Ghanaian diplomat Kofi Annan, little success has been made as tens of people continue to die every day in Syria due to continued fighting. Arab League members gave up their insistence for Assad to step down, but have urged the president to implement the Annan peace plan. The U.S. State Department estimates that 1 million Syrian citizens need humanitarian assistance, but they are not able to receive it until the fighting ceases, for which the State Department criticizes Assad. The Annan plan calls for both sides to start a ceasefire and dialogue, but does not call for Assad's resignation. Between 9,000 and 10,000 Syrians have been killed in the conflict in the last year. As gas prices continue to be prohibitively high, the blame is increasingly falling on President Obama, as perpetuated by viral images on the internet and now a new ad put out by the GOP-aligned oil industry group, American Energy Alliance. The ad will run in 8 battleground states and blames Obama for nearly doubled gas prices during his term, giving millions to the now bankrupt Solyndra, and blocking the Keystone Pipeline. The ad uses the $1.83 average gas price in January 2009 as evidence for Obama's failing ways. The White House countered that that price reflects a time when the economy and demand were even lower, and that 6 months earlier under Bush, oil hit an all-time high. The 2010 Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's often called, is under non-public review after 3 days of hearings at the Supreme Court. The justices will now make a decision that could have massive implications for both Obama and Chief Justice John Roberts' legacy, as they decide whether the health care reform law that requires most Americans to have health coverage is constitutional or not. The judges must also decide whether the entire law would become invalidated if the law's key funding mechanism is deemed unconstitutional. And the House approved the GOP budget yesterday in a 228 to 191 vote. The Republican-controlled House passed the $3.53 trillion GOP budget plan put forth by the up-and-coming Republican Paul Ryan, who serves as the House Budget Committee chairman. Chuck Schumer criticized the plan for not accounting for how the across-the-board tax cuts will be carried out on CBS's Face the Nation last Sunday. Schumer is in favor of higher taxes for wealthier, while Ryan's plan has been criticized for giving too much to the wealthy at the expense of the middle class and seniors in need, as the plan also intends to draw funding away from Medicare. Democrats believe it undermines the bipartisan deficit reduction deal that was struck last year. No Democrats voted for the bill, which is not at all likely to pass in the Senate, but it does provide insight into the differences in spending interests between Republicans and Democrats as election season nears. That's all the news for today. Now starts the main segment of our show on education reform. Sid will explain some background information before we begin our interviews. Over to you, Sid.
Thanks, Andrew. It's been a debate since the time of the ancient Greeks. What is the best way to teach our children? Especially now when a college degree is required for more jobs than ever and master's degrees are becoming the middle-class norm, it is important to understand how the education system works and make sure that it works for everyone it's intended to serve, as best as possible. Education reform is a widespread collection of movements geared toward making education accessible, effective, and more efficient than it is now. The education system in the United States has often been criticized in many different ways for not satisfying our children's needs, and many organizations have tried to fix the problem one way or another, though many children still suffer in the mainstream system as it stands. Modern education reform is tied to compulsory education, which requires children to go to school and revels in the increasing value of education within our society. Modern education reform intends to understand how people learn best and how to go about implementing those changes. Of course, doing so is ridden with political issues, setbacks, lacks of funding, resistance to change, and lack of agreement on what types of learning fit society as a whole. Also, as autism spectrum and attention deficit disorder diagnoses rise, more children are requiring special attention, and the fight to provide the correct education for everyone is becoming that much more complicated and that much more difficult. Since the 1950s, many different education reform initiatives have captured the United States' attention. Many reforms of the 50s to the 70s were implemented out of the civil rights movement, such as ending racial segregation, busing for the purpose of desegregation, affirmative action, and the banning of school prayer, all famous landmark cases. In 1983, Ronald Reagan's National Commission on Excellence in Education released A Nation at Risk, the Imperative for Educational Reform, which purported that America's educational system was failing the national need and falling behind other advanced nations. It enhanced Reagan's effort to reduce or eliminate the Department of Education. The report made 38 recommendations divided into categories of content, standards and expectations, time, teaching, and leadership and fiscal support. Some of the data used as evidence was later disputed, though not widely. In the last 20 years, most school districts have assumed outcome-based education, which involves empirically measuring student performance, or outcomes, often set by federal or state standards and testing. Outcome-based education does not require a particular style of teacher. Rather, it requires demonstrative evidence that students have learned required skills and content. This reform movement culminated in President Bush's No Child Left Behind Act, which required states to set standards and issue assessments to certain grade levels in order to receive federal school funding. Reform movements, organizations are more important than ever today and focus on a variety of issues including longer school days or years, tutoring, charter schools, smaller classes, improved teacher quality, internet computer access, reducing the dropout rate, bilingual education, and neglected infrastructure. Points of View's Andrew Kirkman sat down earlier today with Madison Gardner, co-founder of the on-campus group Students for Education Reform, who shared her thoughts on the organization and reform in general.
Thanks, Sid. And now we're joined by Madison Gardner, the co-founder and vice president of Students for Educational Reform. Madison, thank you for being with us on Points of View today.
Thank you.
To talk about this important issue, and you know, it is a real issue, education reform in this country. So what is the mission of your organization?
Students for Education Reform is an organization that really seeks to empower student leaders to advocate, promote, and spread awareness about some of the key issues in education reform.
So, why is it important for your organization to have it present on Vanderbilt's campus?
Well, I think that we recognize kind of one of the biggest issues in the education reform movement is a lack of qualified and really passionate leaders to engage in the issue. And on Vanderbilt's campus, we have so many students who really care about education, but haven't really had a voice to get involved in the local or state or national kind of communities to really promote and advocate for some of these issues.
Specifically, what type of reform does your organization support?
Well, we are a nonpartisan organization, but we do have several principles that we kind of seek to uphold. Education is kind of a tricky issue because it's so complicated, but some of our principles that we try to maintain in a lot of the things we do is high standards for teacher quality and leader management in the education community, high expectations for all students, and that's really one of the key points to the issue of the achievement gap. And those are examples of some of the principles that we really try to uphold in all of our work.
So, you know, these principles that you're working on, what kind of impact can they have on society?
I think that everyone kind of recognizes that education is the key to being able to do what you want to do in life and having a functioning and successful society. And we live in a society and a country where not all students have the same opportunities to kind of make their dreams come true and do whatever it is that they want. And so closing the achievement gap is really kind of another way of saying just giving everyone the same chance at the same quality education.
You mentioned achievement gap. Can you explain for people who may not know what that means? What is the achievement gap?
The achievement gap is referenced in a lot of different ways, but kind of as it's most fundamentally known is the gap between the scores and performance of certain students versus other areas, mostly geographically based, that are underserved, lower performing, and just generating lower results compared to these other areas. So it's the gap in the actual performance and quality of education.
What type of actions do you plan to take with Students for Education Reform?
Well, we're off to a really good start. We've already got a ton of support all over campus, and we're hoping to really grow the organization. And something that I really hope to kind of bring forth with our organization is to really generate a ton more awareness on campus, really facilitate a conversation between students and professors and faculty members about what are these issues, how do they affect us, and what can we do about them. But also to reach out into the Nashville community and get involved with local schools, local government officials, and really just to totally engage on this issue on many different levels.
So in your personal estimation, what is broken about the education system in our country?
I think it comes down to the issue of equality and same opportunities. I know that there are thousands of students out there who, because of where they are born, are not going to get the same quality of education. They're not going to get teachers who support them and who believe in them, and they're not going to get the resources that they need to succeed and become informed citizens of our country. And so I think that that's one of the most fundamental issues, just that there's this discrepancy between who is able to get a quality education and who isn't.
Has something happened in the country in recent years? Because it hasn't always been this grave a problem. Mm-hmm. Has something changed, do you think?
I personally think that with the rise of, after No Child Left Behind, the standards and testing framework to evaluate education, that just shines a light on the issue, because this issue would probably existed for a long time, but when you're actually making these kids take tests, it becomes very clear, because you can look at a score and you can say, is it that all of these students just aren't able to do well, or is there a bigger issue with the type of education that they're being given that's causing these score discrepancies? So I think that recently the issue has just been kind of illuminated in a really kind of in-your-face way that's hard to deny at this point.
Quickly before you leave, what do we hope, or what do you hope that your organization will imprint on Vanderbilt students?
I hope that, if anything, Vanderbilt students learn about these topics and issues, learn something. I hope that they care, that every time they have a conversation with someone about it, we have kind of imprinted this idea in their head and they can promote it and advocate it on a personal level. And that, of course, that we can reach out into the Nashville community and help in any ways that we can kind of bring about these reforms right here in our neighborhood.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Points of View today.
Thank you.
Sid, back to you.
Well, we've run through the background, we've gotten the student perspective, learned what you can do on campus, and now it's time to speak with a professional on education reform. I'm here with the Executive Director of the Tennessee Charter Schools Association, Matt Throckmorton, to talk about charter schools and their role in the larger education reform context. Thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. So why don't we just start off with the basic question. What is a charter school and what type of students are accepted?
Well, a charter school is a public school, and we have to really emphasize that. A lot of individuals, they get the private concept. It's very much a public school, so we have certified teachers, we do special education, we do the state end-of-year tests, we do all of that. And actually, we do it in the exact same manner in many of those, certainly the end-of-year test. we are given greater autonomy for greater accountability. So with a traditional school, if you don't make the grades, they have a different accountability. With a charter school, they'll just close you down.
Okay.
And for that accountability, we get to do a lot of instructional practices. We get to set our own calendar. We get a lot of variation in how we run it.
Can you talk a little bit more about sort of that variation? What can you guys do that traditional public school might not be able to do?
Well, it's things that they could do, but they have administrative blocks in the process to make those types of changes. Some of our charter schools will actually start the school year in July. They'll go a longer school day. They'll do Saturday schools. They'll have different types of curriculum. We have some charter schools that everything is on laptops. Some charter schools don't use textbooks at all. Some of our charter schools, everything's done with project learning. We're able to bypass a lot of the different obstructions to these types of reforms.
So it's interesting, some of the things you mentioned, sort of Saturday school, starting school in July, laptops in the classroom. It seems like a lot of this stuff is very novel, but at the same time, stuff that can really do great things for student learning. How do you evaluate the success of those kind of initiatives? How do you know when something you've done has succeeded?
Well, a really good aspect of a charter school is they don't just give you one. You have to submit a very detailed application. They tend to be 300 to 400 pages long.
Wow.
And it's not enough to say that we're going to do this, rattle off a list of things you're going to do. You also have to demonstrate how you feel that's going to affect student outcomes, and you're going to have to demonstrate how you're going to measure it, and then set goals for what you expect to achieve with that. And so, saying computers is fun. What are you going to do with them? How are you going to measure them?
Right, that makes sense. So I guess on the flip side of that, what's not quite right with the traditional public school model that doesn't foster the same kind of achievement? We see all these reforms. No Child Left Behind got a lot of press coverage back in 2001, getting a lot more press coverage now as it's an area of national focus, and election is coming up. What is it about the traditional public school model that isn't quite where you want it to be?
Well, we generally don't take a position of what's wrong with the traditional system. I will say that when I talk to school leaders from the traditional public schools, they're really interested in all the autonomy that we have, all the different things that we can just adjust relatively easily. It demonstrates they would like that kind of autonomy, and they don't have it. So that would probably be our biggest criticism. And in fact, of all of our charter schools, almost all of them came from the traditional public system. They were school leaders, principals, and such that were frustrated in their inability to get things done there, so they get it done in a charter school.
That's great. I mean, I think that's definitely the kind of person you want leading that kind of institution. So just from your website, it says that your organization is an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan organization committed to improving student achievement by supporting excellence, innovation, entrepreneurship, and engagement in public education in Tennessee. So how, and you mentioned this a little bit already, but how do charter schools specifically try to provide better, more efficient educations?
We really focus on the school at hand, and so we become a little bit of a laboratory of learning. Our doors are always open. Our charter school leaders are just really happy when people call up and say, we want to come walk through your school. They love to show it off. And so we become an example of what works, and periodically we have charter schools that don't do well, and we become an example of what's not working. And so we have that type of an open door. There are some collaborative relationships that are taking place. Really specifically, they have the Gates Compact here in Nashville. And that's a little bit of its infancy, but the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, a lot of money.
Yeah.
Everybody's hitting him up for money, and of course he wants to invest in what works. And so with charter schools, he realizes that charter schools can work. Some charter schools work exceptionally well. But the broader education reform, how can you help an entire system? And so in a lot of larger cities, there are models of charter schools that are working incredibly well, but there's a disconnect between the charter schools and the traditional LEA. So the Gates, the school district, local education authority. So the Gates Compact is an effort to bring the charter schools and the district together in a collaborative way where they can share, cross-pollination, those types of things.
That's great. Are there any common reform barriers that you find? Why is it that there aren't more of these charter schools? Because from everything you're telling me, it sounds like a great concept, something we should be seeing a lot more of than we currently do.
Two things. One of them is natural and we like, and I mentioned the application process. Right. About 75 to 80% of applicants are denied, and we're really happy with that. If you can't get an application approved, there's no chance you can run a good school. So if you can't get past that hurdle, we're all happy about that. On the flip side, though, a district can put up a lot of barriers and obstruction in the application process. In Tennessee, it's the district that actually grades and reads the application.
Okay.
If they do their job well, you're going to have a small cohort of real high-performing charter schools. If you don't do it well, you'll either have no charter schools or you'll have some that get through that are just bad charter schools.
Okay.
So the district, the authorizer, has a real strong responsibility in this process, and it's something that we encourage, we foster. We don't always agree with them, but we do work with them.
I mean, yeah, one thing that seems to be coming out a lot, and some of the things you're saying, is that there's a lot of accountability, it seems like, built into the system, both from the beginning when you're applying as well as when you're actually implementing the ideas. I think that's great.
Yeah.
What's sort of the political landscape like towards charter schools? A lot of the legislation dealing with charter schools seems to be, nonpartisan, which is a rare occurrence in sort of today's political climate. So, do you have any really great political allies? Is that nonpartisan basis something that you see a lot of?
They can be a little bit partisan. One thing with President Obama that we have really appreciated is he's put charter schools out there. Republicans tend to support charter schools. Democrats have been a little bit hesitant. With President Obama's leadership, we've seen a real strong bipartisan support. Here in Tennessee, we've always gone a little bit slower, and we have really pushed our legislation in a bipartisan manner. It was actually the Democrats that put charter schools into place in 2002. And so we've really approached it that way, and it's been a good model for us.
It's great. And could you talk a little bit about the charter schools amendment bill, the facility bill, et cetera? What do those bills mean for charter schools?
Well, two different bills. The amendment bill is a lot of just operational things that gets into, when a system's smaller, you're kind of like a little bit of wink and a nod, but as you get larger, with districts, you tend to get a little bit more bureaucratic. And so we have some items in there that will insulate charter schools a little bit more from the potential bureaucracy or just rules that don't necessarily make sense. We have other items in there, like we define academic focus, and then we require charter schools to state what is their academic focus, and then we're able to use that with student eligibility and such, so we can line students up with areas of interest, things of that nature. I was going to say, with the facility bill, the districts are a little bit less excited about that. The districts have a number of buildings that are either, well, we contend, our position is that these buildings are not to full capacity. We feel that we should be able to share those with the district. So a wing of it's charter schools, the rest of it is a traditional school. They're not excited about that concept, and so we have legislation that would actually direct the commissioner to put in some guidelines. So the district has one opinion, we have another, but we'll get the commissioner of education to set up some guidelines to help facilitate that discussion.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And going along with sort of political climate, what would you say is sort of the nature of Tennessee in relation to promoting charter schools as compared to other states, both in the Southeast as well as the rest of the country?
Tennessee, the last couple of years, we've been pretty aggressive in the reform. They've really slowed it down, which actually has helped the charter school movement. It's helped us to have a small number of real high-quality charter schools. Now we're going faster with a couple of very specific game plans. One is the Achievement School District, and then the other one is the Incubator, which is seed money came from the Race to the Top grant that we received from the feds. And so we have those two efforts, and then we have the traditional charter schools, and blending those all together into one charter school movement.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to Mr. Throckmorton and Madison Gardner for sharing their insights with us. Be sure to tune in next time to Points of View right here on VTV.